And we're joined by Dr. Adrian Ang U-Jin. He's Research Fellow and Coordinator at the US Program at the Institute of Defense and Strategic Studies, RSIS in NTU. Thanks for coming and joining us this evening, Dr. Ang.
Thank you, Wei Su.
Now, this line, that ties are strong enough to weather the outcome between US and Asia. Well, strength is beside the point. Asia cannot cast a vote on this election. Whoever wins, Asia, with whatever agency it does have, has to sign on with the United States.
Yes, that is certainly true. But if either Trump, or Harris wins, the countries of the region are pragmatic enough to work with whoever comes into office. As the previous package showed, right, Kamala Harris, of course, promises greater continuity with the Biden administration, while Trump, supposedly is this agent of change or disruption. But I think, we should also be careful not to exaggerate too much of the differences. Because if we look back at the Trump administration, certainly in its Indo-Pacific policies, it built very much on the Trump administration's free and open Indo-Pacific strategy.
So Biden built on Trump. In fact, so free and open, that was proposed by Shinzo Abe,
yes,
but brought to prominence under Trump. And even, for example, earlier on the bulletin, we were looking at Quad. Now, that came to prominence also under Mr. Trump, although it was the first leadership-level summit under President Biden. So everyone has to, in a way, distance themselves from the previous administration. But there's more continuity than difference, you're suggesting.
Yes, very much so. So if we look at the broad sweep of U.S. foreign policy, there is always a great degree of continuity, I think, between administrations, right? So we have to bear that in mind and not just focus on any potential disruptions or discontinuities.
So what we certainly saw under Biden, so what Jake Sullivan has referred to as the self-reinforcing latticework of cooperation, that may have started under Trump. And Mr. Trump, this time in his campaign, he and his key spokespeople, they have not disavowed that. They've said, we are not anti-alliance, we're just more into alliances like these, coalitions of the willing.
Yes, that is certainly true. And that will, of course, be reassuring to America's allies in the Asia-Pacific, Australia, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, who are already working together to build this latticework framework of
not just involving
alliances.
the US, with each other.
Yes, yes.
So they're not waiting for Big Brother to step in, they're taking the initiative.
Yes, they are certainly seizing on their own agency. And again, so that is also part of the hedging behavior that was mentioned in the bulletin. They are also hedging against any possible retrenchment of U.S. influence in the region. So they are both working with the U.S., modernizing the hub and spoke alliance system, but at the same time building out the spokes among themselves to create this network or latticework framework of alliances.
Well, given all this chat about unpredictability under a possible Trump 2.0, do you see him walking back Mr. Biden's achievements on foreign policy, which are considerable?
So I think it depends on which policies we're talking about. Certainly, if we look at Europe with U.S. support for Ukraine, there's, I think, a very good chance that Trump will walk back U.S. support for Ukraine. He is probably less likely to walk back support for Israel. In fact, he will probably even give Prime Minister Netanyahu strong support for what he intends to do.
Before we go beyond that to this region, let me pick you up on that. So Ukraine, we've heard a lot of talk about, I will push Mr. Putin and Mr. Zelensky to making a deal, even if that means putting pressure on Ukraine, which Mr. Biden has been very careful not to do. So that's where you see, and also on the NATO alliance.
Yes, he is probably going to really force the NATO alliance to live up to the requirements of spending 2%, at least 2% of GDP for their own defense.
and of course, we always look closer to this region. On tariffs, Ms. Harris has not deviated from that line. We will see tariffs continue, certainly on China. From what you've seen from her campaign, she's not very strong on the foreign policy portfolio. Where do you see Ms. Harris and Mr. Trump, each one of them, where will they go on Asia, on China, and the larger region? So,
this election cycle has been really peculiar in the sense that, usually when the country is at peace, foreign policy doesn't play a very big role in elections. But in this cycle, right, foreign policy has played a smaller role than usual. And I think for Vice President Harris...
Smaller or larger?
Smaller.
Smaller, right.
Right? So for Kamala Harris, I think that is because she was, sort of thrust into the Democratic nomination very late in the game, right? She only basically had a 3-month lead out before the elections. And so she didn't really have time to build up her foreign policy team. So, right, what she spoke of on foreign policy was basically a continuation of the Biden administration's policies. And for former President Trump, right, he doesn't talk about policies because I don't think he's disciplined enough to talk about policy. So we did really get a bit of foreign policy when the vice presidential candidates debated. And really on China, right, there is this bipartisan consensus that China is America's strategic competitor. Right? So I think the Republicans might go even further. So, right, so between the two of them, it's a matter of degree, I think, in dealing with China, right, rather than any strategic differences between the two parties or the two candidates.
Even so, I think it would be too broad a sweep to say, well, it's a case of bad or worse. From what you have seen, how is China measuring its response to a Harris as opposed to a Trump presidency? Final question.
So I was actually just in China last week speaking to interlocutors in China, and they tend to be very pessimistic about the trajectory of US-China relations, regardless of who comes into office. So, right, the people we spoke to basically said that there were only a very small set of issues that they think, right, there can be some sort of agreement on between both
so
sides.
I could very quickly ask you to sum up where they agree and where they will violently disagree.
So where they can agree are really, low-hanging fruit, right? Cooperation on fentanyl, maybe on AI, but on trade, on technology, on Taiwan, right? All these are going to be, right, continuing, right, sort of sore points in the bilateral relationship.
All right, festering points between US-China relations. Oh, thanks so much for coming in and joining us this evening, Dr. Adrian Ang from RSIS in NTU. Thank you.
Thank you, Wei Su.